Hey guys, how's it going? My name's Braden, and I'm the Android tech lead over at Simple Nexus. I work with Mitch on the Android team there, and today I'm going to present on GraphQL. So GraphQL is something we've adopted at Simple Nexus to a degree. We're trying to transition more and more of our endpoints over to it. So it's a relatively new technology compared to alternatives like REST. So yeah, I think it'll be fun to kind of dive into some basics on GraphQL and then how to use it on Android with Apollo. So, all right, so first of all, what is GraphQL? Well, if you go to graphql.org, first thing you'll see is GraphQL is a query language for your API. Really, it's popularly used as an alternative to things like REST for communicating with your backend. So GraphQL is a data query language and specification developed internally by Facebook in 2012 before being publicly open sourced in 2015. So if there's one good thing that's come out of Facebook, it's GraphQL. So, and it provides an alternative to REST-based architectures with the purpose of increasing developer productivity and minimizing amounts of data transferred. So yeah, so let's kind of go over maybe some advantages that GraphQL has versus REST. So first of all, probably my favorite thing about it is you only need to query for the data you need. With REST, you make a call to your backend and you get back oftentimes a whole bunch of stuff that you don't always need. At Simple Nexus, we have some API calls that literally like pages upon pages upon pages of JSON output. And it's kind of difficult to parse and find things. But with GraphQL, like if you only need to query for a few specific fields, you can do that and you'll only get back those specific fields. So you can query for as much or as little data as you need, really. So it uses a single endpoint. So with REST, you oftentimes have one endpoint to do this specific thing, another endpoint to do another thing, and after that you've got a couple dozen endpoints to keep track of. But with GraphQL, it all goes through just the same interface. So there's no callback hell, there's no chaining, flat mapping calls to various endpoints based on getting one piece of data back, doing a second call based on whatever data you get back from the first call. There's really none of that. It has a type system with several built-in types, also allowing custom types. So GraphQL is really cool because it's very strongly typed. Like things are very well defined in GraphQL. Another problem we've run into at the place I work is like sometimes we'll get back JSON responses from our REST endpoints that look like they have the same data structure, but really like sometimes like things that come back as ints sometimes come back as strings, and it kind of gets really annoying to parse when the data is not very consistent. So it's great that GraphQL kind of standardizes on that. There's 5 built-in types. So there's ints, there's strings, there's booleans, I think floats, and then one other I don't remember right now. But and then it also allows custom types. So for example, like a common one is dates. Dates are implemented as a custom type in GraphQL that'll usually be serialized back to your front end as a string. Then you can just parse it however you want. It provides clear and helpful errors at runtime as well as at compile time in the case of Android. If you query something and you get like a field name wrong or whatever, like I've noticed GraphQL is indeed very helpful. Like it'll suggest, maybe like a dozen fields that are like close to what you named it. Like if you typo something, they'll say, did you mean this or this or this? And like it's really helpful in that sense. And as we'll see in a little bit with Apollo client on Android, have that compile time verification of your API. So like, there's no, implementing an API this way and then realizing, oh, your backend dev kind of changed something and didn't tell you, and then your REST API is completely blown up, doesn't work. GraphQL will tell you that at compile time. So pretty cool. Probably my second most favorite thing about GraphQL is the built-in auto-generated documentation. If you use certain tools like GraphQL, which we'll get into in a little bit, you'll see that like the whole schema has auto-generated documentation, so you can see like all of the different objects that your GraphQL schema supports and all the different fields you can query for. The built-in documentation for your GraphQL API is really quite amazing. Honestly, it's a dream come true, coming from someone that has had to kind of guess how REST APIs operate based off of like looking at the actual code with no documentation whatsoever. It's really nice to have. And there's no need for versioning. So fields can be added and deprecated as needed. So you don't have to maintain like a V1 or V2 of your API. You can just say, oh, this field's deprecated, use this one instead. And you can add fields on demand to your GraphQL API as needed. So finally, the dev tools are awesome. Like seriously, there are a lot of different dev tools that will help you when using a GraphQL API. There's just a really good ecosystem that GraphQL developers have implemented, really. So we'll get into a couple of those later on. So, all right, so queries and mutations. So these are the two kind of base concepts of a GraphQL query. So one way to look at it is queries are analogous to a GET call. Mutations are analogous to a POST call. Behind the scenes, it operates almost exclusively on HTTP posts, but just for the purposes of the analogy, like if you're trying to read data, use a query. If you're wanting to write data, use a mutation. And the two are really quite similar syntax-wise. Queries and mutations, they consist of asking for specific fields on objects. And yes, you can return data with mutations as well, which is another cool thing. So, so if you write a mutation, and I feel bad because I'm not going to be demoing mutations in this one because I couldn't find an API, a public API that would work very well with mutations. But yeah, I'm going to go over them really briefly. But basically, yeah, you can, send a list of fields to, how do I describe it? Like, you can send a list of fields to update on your backend, and then you can get back, updated data, fresh data. So like, it kind of eliminates things like race conditions and whatnot, which is nice. And then GraphQL allows you to traverse through a tree of objects and query their fields. So like, there's a lot of nesting that you can do in GraphQL. So like you can get back, a set of fields, but like you want to go deeper down the tree and get more information on a set of fields that gets returned. You can go quite deep and query, whatever you want. So fields can also accept arguments, and you can pass in variables to your queries. So yeah, that helps. In the example I'm going to show in just a second, I have an app with like a search box, and the text of that search box will translate into an argument on a GraphQL query. So you'll see that in action. Let's see. Parameters can be specified as non-nullable. So one thing to note is GraphQL is nullable by default, but it has support for marking specific parameters as nullable using the bang. So pretty cool. And then more things like lists, enums, interfaces, they're also supported. It's kind of the same concept as Java or Kotlin, except implemented in GraphQL. So yeah, and then I have a couple links that I want to show that kind of delve into these concepts a little bit more. So if we click on this first link, let's see, I'm trying to remember what I wanted to show off here. I don't remember, so maybe I'll just skip that. But there was a cool little graphic that I saw earlier today that I wanted to show off in this presentation because GraphQL has this concept of, it's called edges and nodes, and this ties into lists of data, so you can get back lists of data, and this will kind of show you how, like, in the concept of a GraphQL tree, like this kind of shows you kind of like in a graphical level what edges and nodes are. So like if you have like a, say you have a bunch of different users in your system, like each user would be considered a node, and then you have connections to different objects in your graph. So you have like a bunch of users users can be friends with one another. So you have a user that has a bunch of different friends. These friends are considered edges, and so you can query. Say you can query on a user. I want to get the number, the names of friends that this user has. So these friends would be considered edges, and then you get back a list of nodes, which are other users, and then they can link to, for example, we have this other object type, a post, and you have these edges right here. So like a user liked this post. Here, this post is authored by this user. So this graphic really kind of dives into the power of GraphQL in exactly what you can return. So any questions so far? And I'm kind of rambling, but.
The version you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah.
Can it morph the data? Like for instance, if I have a version V1 client and I have a V2 client.
Yeah.
And it's calling up, but yet the data needs to be migrated on the server side because the way we're doing IDs or something like that changed. Can you handle that with the GraphQL? That it can transform the data so that the old client can get the old way of getting it?
That's a good question. That's something I have not yet had to experience myself. Does anyone else know?
Do that with mutations.
Yeah, like.
So the mutations, are they defined on the server side?
They can be defined on both, if I remember correctly.
Because I understand that you can go through and request the data you want specifically, but what if the data I want specifically is no longer?
Then you can send a mutation with what the format of that used to be.
The client has to send it, or is it handled on the server?
The client can send it, but I think the server can also handle it.
Because I was going to say my client.
Yeah, you can have predefined mutations on the server side. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question or not, but yeah.
So I've actually handled something similar. If you put up a query on your server side that is expecting the data to come in the old form, you can then handle it and resolve into the form that you need and return back the correct data on the server side, so that your client doesn't have to handle anything differently.
Cool. Yeah, great question. Sorry, I don't really have a clear answer for that, but yeah. And then I just wanted to go over a few more concepts. So I'll be showing off kind of a demo GraphQL app, but I want to keep it like super simple. So I just want to go over a couple core concepts that I won't be going over in the demo, but GraphQL also has the concept of fragments, and it's really cool because like they're actually really similar to Android fragments in a way. It's a way to reuse certain bits of queries in other queries. So with fragments, you can construct sets of fields and include them in different queries as needed. And I'll show you an example of that that's just on the GraphQL website in a second. But yeah, you can define just like a fragment of a query with a shared set of fields, and then just reference it in however many other queries you want, as long as they try to get back the same object type. So it's pretty cool. It's really handy to use. And then one more thing, union types. So union types are kind of similar to interfaces, but they don't get to specify any common fields between the types. So like, say you have like 3 different object types that, or say you have like an object that you want to get back, but it can be defined like 3 different ways internally, and you want to get back different sets of fields depending on what type of object gets returned, then you can define a union type and then query off of the union type. So another thing to note is GraphQL has this special type, or the special field called __ type name, and the type name returns, it basically returns, you know, the name of the type basically for you. It's kind of like a reflective call to get the class name in Java or Kotlin. An Apollo client returns that for you automatically. Other GraphQL clients may not return automatically, but that is something to note, is that Apollo will just do it for you, which helps with things like debugging. So, and yeah, let me go over this. Let me go to this link real quick, just so you guys can see what these look like, since I won't be going over them in my demo app. So we go to interfaces, let's see, union types. Yeah, so here's an example of what union types look like. So you can define this, you know, this search result as either a human, a droid, or a starship. You can have this query right here. You can search for some text, but you know, a human has a name and height. A droid, we just want their name and their primary function, and their starship, we just want a name and length. So, so here's the query itself, and then the results. We can see we get back different fields depending on what the type name that we get back. So pretty cool. And then fragments. Where on here does it go with fragments? Let me see. Right here. Let's see.
You just spoke past it.
Well, yeah, I mean, this shows you usage of fragments, but I know that, okay, here it is. Okay, yeah, so right here, there's 2 different queries. There's, you know, a left comparison and a right comparison, and both of these queries share. So without fragments, we would have had to specify all of these different fields twice, but we can break them out into a fragment here because all of these fields query the character object, and we can specify them right here with ... comparison fields. So, and then as you can see, the same data comes back in both the left comparison and the right comparison. So yeah, pretty cool. All right, let's switch back to the slide deck. Let's see. I don't know how good to go back full screen, but we can just do this. Okay. So for DevTools, as I explained before, GraphQL is a web-based tool. It's hosted on your server, so on the same server that your GraphQL API is hosted on. And it allows you to run queries and mutations on demand, as well as view your documentation. So it's basically like a sketch pad that you can use to just sketch out your queries before you define them in your Android app. So it's pretty cool, and I'll go over that in the demonstration in just a moment. And I'll show you how GraphQL organizes the documentation in your GraphQL endpoint as well. Apollo Client DevTools. So this is a Chrome extension, and it basically is GraphQL, but in your Chrome DevTools. So the way it works is you authenticate to your website that uses GraphQL, and then just pop open your Chrome DevTools, and there's an Apollo tab, and you can view your documentation and, you know, run queries using the instance of GraphQL that's inside the DevTools. So it's really handy. I'm not going to show that off here, but it's basically the same thing as GraphQL, just inside your Chrome DevTools. So you don't have to have a separate hosted version of GraphQL on your production server. Pretty cool. And then JS GraphQL is an extension for IntelliJ and Android Studio. And It gives you syntax highlighting, autocomplete, all that good stuff for GraphQL files inside your Android Studio or IntelliJ project. And you can also run queries and things like that inside the JS GraphQL extension. So I would consider this almost a must-have if you're dealing with GraphQL on Android. It helps out a lot to have that syntax highlighting and that autocomplete. So, and then there are other dev tools. I found out today Postman actually is adding beta support for GraphQL, which is cool. I use Postman a lot for REST, and soon you'll be able to use GraphQL inside Postman. And then there's another tool called Insomnia that I've never used before. It's another kind of a REST tool that has added support for GraphQL. So if you have these standalone tools installed on your machine already, they probably already support GraphQL, which is awesome. So, all right, let's do the first demo real quick. Let's see. All right. So there are a bunch of different public GraphQL APIs that you can use for demonstration purposes. So I'm a big music fan, and I really like finding out more information about my favorite artists and what albums they put out. And so I found a GraphQL API for MusicBrainz, which is a online music database. So let's get rid of this query here. So let's say I want to query, let's see. Well, first of all, so let me show you the documentation explorer over here. So again, this is graphical. Yeah, let me zoom in a little bit more. So yeah, so this is graphical. This is hosted on the same server as the GraphQL API. So on the left-hand side, we'll define our query. This middle pane will see the results, and then here's the documentation explorer. So this GraphQL API doesn't support mutations. So again, I'm super bummed I won't be able to show that off. But if it did, mutations would show up as a root type. But we do have a root type of query. So we can come here and we can see all the different things that we can do on queries. So let's say that I want to search MusicBrainz. So let's go ahead and do search, and then let's see what we can search for. Let's say I want to search for some artists. So we do artists, and this query, this field takes some parameters. So let's see, does anyone have a favorite band that they want me to search for? Just yell one out.
Justin Bieber.
Justin Bieber, awesome.
That's what we are all next.
All right, so we define our parameters like this. So query : Justin Bieber. I hope I spelled that right. I guess we'll find out soon enough. Let's go ahead and try to run this. Oh yeah, I need to specify some more fields on artists. So let's see. So this will return a list of artists. So remember I talked earlier about edges and nodes. So I first need to return edges, and then get a node from there. And then as you can see, this node is of type artist. So let's just get a list of names of people in this database that are named Justin Bieber, or entries that are named Justin Bieber. And as you can see, we're getting back a list of people that, match up with Justin Bieber, I guess. Justin Timberlake is one of them. That's interesting. Let's say I want to know what country these artists are from as well. All I have to do is add country into here, rerun the query. I can see Justin Bieber's from Canada, and then a couple other people like Justin Timberlake's from the US. So that's an example of just a super simple GraphQL query. And I could keep on, I could keep going if I wanted to. So let's say I want to know like the gender associated. So I know Justin Bieber's a male, Justin Timberlake's a male.
So can this query accept like regex string patterns?
Yeah, so you can, in your client, you can specify regex and then send that to the GraphQL query. I don't know if GraphQL itself specifies or allows you to use regex. Does anyone else know?
It'll be in the how you set up the resolver on the server side.
Yeah.
So do you have two different last names up there? I can't completely read it, but the last name
In my query?
on the left side versus the right, versus the middle.
Yeah, so this is the query that I've written out, and then these are the results here. So you might be looking at node. Is that what you're?
Now, see, Bieber is spelled differently in the first result versus what you queried.
Oh yeah, it's probably just some fuzzy searching. So on their back end.
Well, because there's Justin Timberlake, there's somebody that was just Justin.
How they wrote the resolver.
So it's probably
Yeah.
just
Like
like
it's searching it
first
per
name
word.
matched.
Yeah.
Depends on how they wrote the resolver.
I wonder if I correct the last name, if it gives me, okay, now it's giving me other beavers. So, and yeah, like GraphQL is pretty agnostic when it comes to like your backend and front end implementations. Like it's just a query layer over it. And so if you want to implement fuzzy result, if you want to have GraphQL return fuzzy results like we saw earlier, like you would implement that in your backend and then feed that to GraphQL. So.
What is your default return search like size? Like how many nodes can we get back at once?
That's a good question. I'm not sure what the default is.
With GraphQL, I think the default is 50, but you can specify for less. And then to do more, you have to get into like paging.
Is there,
Producers.
so if you use the GitHubs, like I've used John with GitHub, GraphQL, and it's 500,000 nodes.
Okay, yeah.
So, I mean, and that might be something they customize. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Server,
Yeah, it's probably server side.
Yeah.
So let's say I wanted to make
Yeah, 500,000 nodes total. But now that's also dependent on, say, you have 100 nodes of one thing, but if they all have 100 sub nodes underneath that, that's 100,000.
But I would just want to say, I want to get all the data. I have 100,000 records. Page. I can't say I just want to create a stream and I'll just stream the results.
Not that I know of. I don't know.
So you can have it just get like the first few results. So say I just want like 5. I can specify that in this, we have this first parameter that takes an int. So say I just want 5 results. It only gave me 5 results. So like you don't have to get the whole 100,000 if your API is going to return 100,000. I don't know why it would, but.
Well, the reason why I'm asking is to say I'm using it for a sync mechanism.
Yeah.
And I just want all my records for offline.
Mm-hmm.
So I would have to continually call this thing over and over and over instead of just saying, hey, just give me everything you got.
Yeah.
Since this state.
And again, it depends on the limits of the backend.
It really just depends, yeah.
Does it do any catching for the second and third pages or anything extra past the first page?
You can set up caching.
Yeah,
with Apollo.
it has built-in caching support. The Apollo client does. And it also has paging support. So, yeah. But yeah, like it's really easy to limit the amount of results you get back with GraphQL. And yeah, GraphQL sets you up really nicely for implementing paging. So, yeah.
And is that documentation like auto-generated, or do you think they wrote all that? Like,
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's auto-generated. Like the formatting is auto-generated, but like you like for example this description, like you would define that yourself, like when you write your schema out. But like this whole HTML thing like is auto-generated from the schema by graphical. So
It's been my understanding of that. I'm not 100% on this, but I think as you write your resolver, right, you write a resolver for each piece of data. So
Yeah.
each one, it's very easy to say, okay, as you're building documents, write down what is this piece of data, and it's just a really small snippet. But as you go through each and every piece, you build up this huge thing, you've generated data, your doc's out of that.
Yeah. Again, and I don't know how to set up GraphQL on the back end. Like I'm purely just an Android developer. I'm focusing on consuming GraphQL APIs versus producing them. So, but yeah, this is, yeah, I mean, you specify like a description of whatever fields, a description on a field, and then, this will just generate the documentation for you in a really nice way. So anyway, any other questions before we move on?
But you probably showed us this, but then how do you define, like that query, is that just a string that you store somewhere and you send it, you somehow populate it?
Yeah, I'll get into that in the context of Android. I'll get into all that coming up. Yeah. Basically, there's these .graphql files that you just throw your query in, and then I'll show you how Apollo Client picks those up. And there's a lot of behind-the-scenes magic that it does that I'll get into. So, all right. So let's move on. Apollo Client for Android. So Apollo is kind of the gold standard for GraphQL clients. There's others out there, but Apollo is the most widely used one. And they have a really good web client. They also have an iOS client and an Android client. And what Apollo does is it generates Java files at build time based off of predefined GraphQL queries and mutations. And what's cool about it is you don't need to manually keep models up to date. Like back when I was doing a lot of REST stuff, like I'd have to, whenever my backend guy would change the model on the server side, like I'd have to make sure that I also update the client side models. And I don't know, in my opinion, it gets kind of messy, and like the way you name your Android classes can always be very inconsistent with how your backend developer names their models. So yeah, it's kind of a mess. And GraphQL, it generates your models for you. So it's a lot nicer, keeps things much more consistent between backend and your Android app. So it provides compile time verification of queries based off of the pre-generated schema. So the way Apollo Client works, and I'll get into that a little bit later, is it performs what's called an introspection query, or you perform an introspection query on your GraphQL API, which basically downloads the whole schema into a JSON file. And then what Apollo Client will do is at build time, it'll verify your GraphQL queries based off of that schema. And if something doesn't match, it'll stop your build and it'll throw an error at you. And again, those errors are really helpful. And it's really nice to have everything just up front. You don't have to wait for you push your app to production and then it crashes due to, oh, your backend guy changed a couple things and forgot to version their API, or didn't bother to version their API. Yeah, anyway. It allows you to find adapters for custom types. So kind of like how in Retrofit, you can add adapters for, where's that JSON? Yeah, like in JSON and Moshi, you can define different adapters for JSON that comes back. Apollo Client allows you to do that as well for custom GraphQL types. And I'll get into that. One thing they just barely added this in the last release, but so when they first wrote Apollo Client, it was kind of more Java focused, but and like you could use it with Kotlin, but it was a little bit clunky. But now they have experimental Kotlin friendly model generation, which is nice. Because beforehand it generated like actual methods in the pre-generated Java files, and you'd have to reference them from your Kotlin code, but now you can just operate directly on the Kotlin fields, and it feels a lot more idiomatic that way. That's an experimental feature. I do have it enabled on my demo app that I'll show you. I think it's pretty great, but keep in mind, it is experimental for now. This is still quite a new thing. Apollo Client supports RxJava and also Kotlin coroutines. The example I'm going to show is going to use RxJava, but they are working on coroutine support. It's still in alpha right now, but it's pretty promising. How would you say it's working pretty well? Coroutine support?
Trying to remember. Yeah, it was working pretty well.
Yeah.
I ran into a few hiccups
Okay.
with it, but that was based on it interacting with other.
Cool. Yeah.
But honestly, since coroutines can interact with RX,
Yeah.
it is easy to interchange it.
Cool. Yeah. Don't we all ask that?
Alpha, so honestly, Apollo client went stable just like a month ago, and longest time is alpha, and it just like skipped like beta and everything, just went straight to stable.
Yeah.
And the experimental was added like a month or like a couple weeks before it
Yeah.
went to stable.
So like the the Kotlin model generation is already in the stable version of the Apollo client library, but it's just an experimental feature versus coroutines, which the library is still marked as alpha. I mean, I don't know if there's really much of a difference between experimental and alpha. Like this is just a little bit more cutting edge stuff in the Apollo library. Like if you want to stick to what's stable, you'd use RxJava and turn off the Kotlin model generation. That's all been battle tested. That's all been marked stable by Apollo. But yeah, sometimes I like to live on the cutting edge though when I use stuff like this.
And Kotlin is available on the stable branch, whereas the coroutines isn't.
Right. Yeah. Apollo supports built-in disk caching for responses. It's an optional feature. We at Simple Nexus, we have it turned off because we already have a room-based caching system in play. But if you don't want to use room for whatever reason, you can just have Apollo client cache responses for you. And supposedly it has a certain amount of offline usability when you do that. So I've not dived into that myself, but sounds pretty cool. So, all right, so let's demo Apollo client in the context of an Android app. Okay, so got my Android project pulled up here. Let me zoom in on this real quick. Okay, so this is my app level build.gradle. Everyone see that okay, right? Yeah. So we have this build script, and this build script block actually ties into the root level Gradle. But anyway, so we specify the Apollo Gradle plugin right here, and then we apply it to the top here. I'm applying it after the Kotlin Android application, but before Kotlin Android stuff. And then here's where you can configure the Apollo client, at least the build time portion of it. So here I have a few custom type mappings. So the MusicBrainz API that I'm using, it returns a few different type mappings. So first of all, there's a URL string, and I'll show you a little bit later how it gets mapped in the Kotlin code. But I'm using a type mapping to map this directly to a URI, an Android URI. And then a MusicBrainz ID, I'm mapping straight to a string. And then a date. So in a real app, you might want to map this to like java.util.date or something similar. But for simplicity's sake, I'm just mapping it to a string.
Can you register type converters?
Yes. Yeah. And I'll show you where these are registered in a little bit. And then I have the option to generate Kotlin models turned on. It's false by default, but I have it turned on because I think it's pretty nice. And in the future, when it's not experimental, I think if you use Kotlin, you'll probably want to have it turned on. It's just an overall nicer experience. Oh, and I have, in my build script, I have my GraphQL endpoint defined up here, just for convenience. So It's the same URL that I was using here, well, except without the .graphql part. But anyway, so, and then here are my other dependencies. So these are the dependencies that get compiled into the Android app. So as you can see, I have the Apollo runtime and then also RxJava 2 support that I'm specifying. If you're using coroutines, it would be Apollo-coroutine support, I think. Yeah, and then, so like I said earlier, you have to do what's called an introspection query on your API first before you can use the Apollo client on Android. And you can do that manually, and you can keep that up to date manually if you want, but I have a Gradle task here that will generate that schema for me. So what Apollo client does behind the scenes at the build level is it downloads a version of Node.js, and then it runs the Apollo code gen node package. And what I can do is, and it ships with a plugin, a Gradle plugin that lets me run node commands. So I basically, every time I do a Gradle sync or every time I do a rebuild, it will call this node, it will run this node script with a couple arguments. So introspect schema, and then I supply that GraphQL endpoint that I put up at the top. One caveat to this is it kills your reproducibility. So if you're concerned about reproducible builds, I would probably recommend you just run the introspect schema manually and check it into your repo. But it is really nice to always have a fresh schema up to date, and you don't have to worry about manually. Running the introspection every once in a while. And it's a good practice to have some kind of authentication behind it. Otherwise, anyone can just pull down all of the information on your GraphQL schema willy-nilly, and they can reverse engineer you and whatnot. So you can also specify a header with a token optionally. So, and then I just hook into the generate schema task, which is provided by the Apollo plugin. So it's a really slick way of not having to worry about keeping my schema up to date. So let me go into my project files real quick here. So it's the same layout as a normal Android project with the exception of this GraphQL folder. I know it's kind of hard to see, but so you'll have a GraphQL folder that lives alongside your Java and your res and your manifest. And here's where my generated schema lives. I can open this up real quick just so you can see what the schema looks like. And it's quite long, but the Apollo client will go through this and parse it, and it will use this to verify your .graphql files. I have a couple different GraphQL queries here. So I have what's called an artist search query. And this is something I didn't touch on before, but this artist search query is called an operation name. And you can specify operation names. Kind of helps with things like debugging. So like if you're having trouble with the query, you can have the server log the operation name so you can know, oh, there's a problem with this query instead of just having it be anonymous. So this is a very similar query to what I showed off earlier. So I'm initiating a search. I'm going to search for an artist, and here's where I can specify a parameter. So in my Kotlin code coming up, you'll see that I can specify an input variable, and that automatically gets translated to this query here. So I can specify an input. It's a non-nullable string, and that gets put down here. So again, that query command with the input variable. And then I query my edges, get my nodes, then I can get the name of the artist, the area that they're from, and some fan art, because apps just are snazzier with images, right? So let's go in and see how this is set up in my Kotlin code. So here in my view model, here's where I build the Apollo client. So I just do Apollo client.builder. I specify the server URL, and I expose it via build config from my build.gradle. I can specify an OKHTTP client if I want. So here I'm building a custom OKHTTP client that will give us some additional logging. And then the type adapters. So these are those same 3 custom types that I specified in my build.gradle here. So I have a URL string, an MBID, and a date, and I specify them here in my custom type adapters. And down here, I have the actual adapters specified. So you just override encoding it and then decoding it. And yeah, so here I'm creating a URI, for example, from the raw string. So, okay. And then I can build the Apollo client here. And then here's where I can do a search. So again, I'm hooking into RxJava here. So when you're using the RxJava support, it's just rx2apollo.from and then Apollo client.query. If I were doing a mutation, it'd be Apollo client.mutation. So this query takes a parameter of an artist search query. And let me open this up real quick. This is auto-generated from this GraphQL file. So it took this and it generated a Java file. Yeah, and it's quite long and quite verbose and not a whole lot of fun to look at, but here you can see like some of the models it generates. Like here's a data class for an edge, a data class for an artist. Oh, it actually generated a Kotlin file. I didn't realize that. Oh, did you know that?
Yeah.
Like when you turn on the Kotlin support, it generates Kotlin files instead of Java. That's cool. I didn't notice that.
And it's a lot prettier to look at than the Java.
Yeah, the Java generated code is much worse. But you won't really have to look at it normally because you would just go off of your GraphQL file and then go from there. But yeah, so it generates data classes based off of everything that you specify in here. So yeah. But yeah, we don't really need to look at this ugly file. So here's another thing is, so when you enable the Kotlin generation, your parameters are constructor parameters. So kind of similar to how I am putting a parameter in here. Same thing, it's just the parameters in the constructor for my Kotlin object. So pretty similar, and then the rest is just standard Rx stuff. I get back a response that's of the type artist search query.data, and then I've got a couple of live datas that I set that to. So same thing, but for a different query that I haven't gone over yet. From the Android side, let's see. Yeah, so this screen, basically it's a search box and then a recycler view that'll get populated with results from my GraphQL API. And here you can see where I'm using, so this is the adapter for my recycler view, and I have a results variable, which is a list of those edges. And when I set that, let's see, where am I observing? Okay, yeah, so it is the data that comes back from my view model that I set in my live data. And then again, here's search, artists, and edges. These are not specified as non-nullable in the GraphQL schema, so I do have to specify them as nullable in Kotlin, which is a little bit of a pain, but I mean, that's Kotlin protecting you from the $1 million mistake. So anyway, yeah, so does that kind of make sense? Like, I have my search object, artists, edges. It all gets translated into here. And I'm just referencing them via the generated Kotlin objects. So pretty cool. I don't have to mess around with maintaining my own models or anything. Yeah, pretty cool.
And if you do want your own models, it's pretty easy to convert.
Yeah, pretty easy, just write a converter.
Especially since you know what the data is going to look like.
Yeah. Okay, should we run this and see what it looks like? Everyone see this? Let's see, if I move it over here, it'd probably be, I guess it doesn't matter. I don't know. But anyway, let's run this app. So let's search for an artist. My all-time favorite is U2. I'm gonna search for U2 here. As I search this, I'm gonna have my logcat open because I'm gonna be logging the raw HTTP requests. So
Get a logger interceptor.
yeah, I've got a logger interceptor set up here, and that will intercept my my requests. So let's perform a search here, and okay. So this is what the raw request looks like. Let me get rid of some of this junk here. Okay. So as you can see, here's my GraphQL endpoint right here. It's slow because I'm on my hotspot. So normally they're not this slow in real life. But and it does a post request. Usually in GraphQL, everything operates off of posts. Apollo client will add some headers, and then here's the body. So it specifies the operation name and the variables, and then it sends the query over just as one big string. That is loud thunder.
That was thunder? Yeah.
I think that's thunder. I don't know. So
Yeah, it sounds
pretty cool. Yeah, so the GraphQL service on the back end will take this query string and it will return some results for me if I can get the network to work properly. It's being really slow. Let's try something here.
What's the oldest version of Android you can use with GraphQL?
I don't know off the top of my head, but at SimpleNexus we do API 21 and up, and it works great with all of that. So. Yeah, it's called. I'll post a link. I'll post a link in the Slack. It's really nice. It's just called Logging Interceptor. Maybe I can look it up real quick. It's like the enhanceable.
Look at your.
I don't know. I'll post a link to it in Slack because it's really quite nice. Let me see if.
Brayden,
Hey.
you switch Wi-Fi networks, so you might need to restart your emulator.
Yeah, trade some.
Oh, is that
Yeah,
a thing?
if you switch networks with the emulator open, the emulator doesn't have data.
I did not know that. That's awful.
It's pretty frustrating.
That is super frustrating. All right, I'll do that. Do I need to do a cold boot or?
No.
Okay.
Just need to relaunch the emulator.
It's just the VM that is running on.
Okay.
Bugs been there for like 3 years.
At least.
I've known it for 3 years.
Okay.
So frustrating.
Yeah, things bigger than the grade.
Is there a guest network? Oh, here it is. Okay. I pulled up some stuff. Okay.
So the question is, did you enable the cache?
I didn't explicitly enable it.
Can you, how quick is it to enable? Can you enable it and then turn off the network?
I don't know. I've never done it. That'd be fun.
To
You done
do
it?
caching, you do have to, when you set up your Apollo client, you have to set up the rules for it.
Oh, okay.
Never mind.
So it's not just like a 2-second thing. Yeah.
But
That'd be cool though. I do want to look into it. But.
it's cool, you can do it, like, you can set it so that it will try cache first or try network first, and you can set all the rules.
Yeah. Okay. So my very slow hotspot eventually got back a response. So here's the GraphQL response, and here's the data that it returned. So yeah. So it got me this list, and it's, yeah, in that same format as in GraphQL. Yeah, and then Apollo client took that and worked its magic, and here we go. So here's a list of artists that are called U2, and apparently there's more than one. I think there's a lot of junk data in this database, but it works for demonstration. So one thing I didn't note is that I am using Picasso for the thumbnails. Everything runs off of GraphQL with the exception of Picasso, because Picasso is just too good not to use, in my opinion. So, all right, so I have a second query set up. That's kind of a details screen. So I'll show you my details. So in my artist search query, I'm getting back the MBID, or I'm querying for the MBID. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a different query called lookup. So I'm going to look up an artist by the MBID rather than doing just a text search. And then in this details view, I want a nice banner. So I'm going to request fan art banners and the URL for that. I'll get the name again, and then I want the first 30 releases from that artist. Here's an example of some enums that are being used. So like, you know, for like the size of this banner, I can request a full size, or I can do like there's an enum for a smaller size, etc. So yeah, so like preview. So I wanted to change this to like preview. Yeah, so pretty cool. So yeah, and then in this query, I'm just going to get the first 30 releases from this artist. And I'm going to get the title of the release, the date of the release, and then I can query a cover art archive, get the front cover of it, again, in a full size. So, so let's switch back over to the emulator. This log. So I'm going to click into this entry for U2 right here. And then this does another request for that details query that I just did. You can see the operation name is the artist details query. And there we go. I got back the response. It gave me a list of albums and a list of you know, a bunch of different URLs for cover art and things like that. So yeah, here's again, a bunch of junk data in this database, a lot of duplicates, but it looks cool. So yeah, I can search for different artists if I want. So I can search for like Keen, for example. That's another GraphQL query. Yeah. So again, completely driven by GraphQL with the exception of the artwork. Yeah. So yeah, it's pretty cool stuff. Was there anything else that I wanted to show off in the sample project? Let's see. I don't think so. Cool. Any other questions so far?
Yeah, I have a question about in the Gradle file, it had the generating schema portion. So that was tied to every build or compile. When did you run that?
Yeah, so this will run on every build and also every Gradle sync. So if I do a Gradle sync real quick,
builds as well as local builds, right?
Yes. Yeah, and this is just something that I wrote. Like, this is completely optional. You don't have to have this in here. This is just something for convenience.
You don't forget and you don't refresh.
Yeah.
it in a month or something.
Yeah.
If you're
So
working on like a newer project where the backend is constantly changing and updating because everything's not finalized,
Especially
it's
dev, yeah.
really nice.
yeah,
We have it now. We have a Python or a shell script or something. I
yeah,
don't want to forget, to hit that.
yeah. So this is I'll post it. I have a link to the GitHub repository, and I can post that in the channel as well. And if you want to add this task to your own GraphQL Android projects, like
How much time does that add to your build time, especially if you have a big schema?
It's just pulling down a JSON file, right?
Well, no, but it's got to
it's got to generate it. It adds a few seconds. It's not the fastest thing in the world.
It only generates
Yeah.
the code for the queries that you make.
Well, it pulls down the whole schema. Like,
Parts of the schema, that's all done in nodes.
yeah,
Which isn't take long to take startup, but it's some time there.
yeah,
But then it goes through and gens all the objects.
Yeah,
every single
like
time.
I noticed when I do GitHub, which is like, there's like 100,000 lines or something.
Yeah.
It's huge.
yeah,
It took a while to parse. I mean, it's 20 seconds or something.
yeah. So it will add a bit of a noticeable impact on your build times. At Simple Nexus, we have a lot of custom logic that it draws from the network and things like that anyway. So for us, it wasn't a big deal to add this, but it can be noticeable. Again, this is just for convenience. But yeah, it will impact your build times a little bit. But in my opinion, the trade-off is worth it, just to have a set it and forget it solution for your schema.
Yeah.
So
So you mentioned, all these good things that it does compared to REST. So what are the negative things that you see?
yeah, build times are a bit slower, like we just talked about, not just for getting the schema, but also, it's adding generated code. It has to generate the code each time, and yeah, it will slow down your build a little bit more than just having everything predefined. It's newer, it's a little clunkier, not quite as battle tested as REST is. Like the Apollo client for Android just barely hit 1.0.0 a few weeks ago. So like this, it's still brand new. In my opinion, pretty stable, but I mean, if you want something that's rock solid and battle tested, GraphQL may not be for you. A little bit of a learning curve just because it is something different than what has come before.
My biggest issue I've had working with it is sometimes it's a pain to navigate through the different models.
Yeah.
Because there's that giant one, and then I'm like, okay, I want to get to this piece of data, and it's like just navigating down.
Yeah.
There was several days of headaches learning that.
So the first thing that comes to mind a little bit with this is this just an easy way for your server-side guys to say, here's one endpoint, figure out what you want, versus going, okay, I have a very concise REST endpoint that's very optimized for the calls that I need.
Yeah.
Right? So you're solving for world hunger on the server side, and you may not necessarily have optimized queries or optimized indexes for very specific use cases, right?
Right.
So there's got to be a little bit of a performance hit somewhere with this kind of universal.
Yeah, and I don't know performance-wise on the back end whether
Are you guys using this in full production at this point?
we do. We still kind of have one foot in GraphQL and one foot in REST, and like we are very much using a mix of both. Like we're trying to transition over to full GraphQL, but yeah, we're not quite there yet.
So I work entirely on the server side. One of the things that we heard at the GraphQL conference last year that really hit us and we've implemented all the way through is for mutations in particular, you build for the business use case. So you're naming your mutation name something that makes sense for this is what it's going to do.
And you optimize the server side for those mutations.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so your entire use case of what you want to do is optimized around that for each one.
But every time you make a call to these service calls, you have to build this thing and send it up to the client, right? Instead of making a little micro call saying, hey, just give me the latest
That
data.
depends on your mutation or your
Yeah.
Oh, because I could have an optimized mutation that's already set up. And I'm
Exactly.
saying,
Yeah.
mutation.
You
It's
can
already set up on the server
predefine-
side for mutations.
You can predefine mutations and queries on the server side, and then all you have to do is just, instead of sending the whole query, the whole JSON for the query, you just say, hey, GraphQL server, run this predefined query.
So you could version your mutation then probably.
You could, yeah,
You could,
in theory.
but
So you're doing
there's
rest
not a
of graph
great
QL.
reason
Yeah,
to do
exactly, right? So, yeah.
So if you have a single endpoint, does it fork out to multiple, I mean, you have
that. So
an abstraction layer that then forks out to a bunch of others.
So, for
we
example,
did it over here.
what he was doing with the artist search query,
Yeah,
that's the name of your resolver.
sure.
So on the server side, whatever name you're passing through
Okay.
goes to that resolver.
And then that resolver may say, I'm gonna go
Do whatever it needs
whatever it
to.
needs to do
Yeah.
now.
Yep.
Versus saying, I'm gonna go directly over here that has a different resolver.
Mhm. So in the schema like you were showing, you specify what type you're returning. And so on your resolver, you have to return that type. It will automatically go through, do all your data connections and stuff like that for you on the server side. They actually put out a nice thing that's called data loaders that will just auto wire all that together for you. So it'll get all of that automatically. You just have to say, here's what I'm returning for this object.
And there are times, I've experienced times where you do like a mutation, you get it back, and you do something based on that, and then you do like another mutation or another query. But like you'll run into like weird race conditions sometime where this resolver's responded back before this one, and now like data can be a little weird. Depending on how many queries and mutations and all that you're doing in one thing. And how you chain it can get a little weird.
Oh, the tooling, you said there's some cool plugin stuff for.
I need to show you, yes, I need to show you JS GraphQL. Yeah, so in my GraphQL file here, all this highlighting is coming from that JS GraphQL plugin, and I can specify different endpoints here. It operates off of this .graphql config file where you can just define different endpoints, and yeah, you can run queries here, from within the IDE itself. So this one I need to specify a variable for, but yeah. And you can view the docs from in here as well. If you go to schemas and project structure, you can search the schema registry. So let's say I want more information on like an artist. It's the raw markdown, but so it's not as pretty as if you're going to search it in graphical, but it is all in here if you don't want to leave the IDE.
And if the stuff is named properly, if you go back to the query,
Yeah.
You like say on like the name part, if you were to want to say add one after name, like say like gender or whatever, like it gives you what options you have.
Yeah.
That's great.
And
Yeah,
it
you
says-
get-
and it has the
Wasn't this file created from the servers that plugin that you?
No.
Oh, no.
This was the.
Okay, this one you write yourself.
Yeah.
But the
Yeah.
other files
It's
in
a
there
schema
were.
JSON.
Yeah. So yeah, when you do the introspection query, it gives you this schema.json, and yeah, everything is generated off of this thing, and it's like, yeah, a good 17,000 lines long. But
So you just add all your mutations and queries into that one file, the one file right there.
yeah, so yeah, here, yeah, this GraphQL directory, you can just you can have as many .graphql files as you want, or you can even have multiple queries in one file if you want. Say that again, sorry.
Well, I was wondering if you could just stack, put a bunch of them that are related to each other.
You can, yeah, you can totally stack them, and the Apollo client will generate, yeah, it'll generate different files for each one. So you don't have to break them out into different files if you want to.
And you can easily get like, say, you have 3 different queries, but they're all separate, so you don't want them in the same file. But they all have one part that's the same data. You could have a fragment where it's a separate file and it's all
Yeah.
the same. So you're not having to duplicate code.
Fragments can be in a separate file.
Yeah.
So it can get clean. It can be as clean or messy as you want.
So if you, with the plugin, and you want to test it, is there a way to put it in, like, if it's behind an authenticate, you know, you have to authenticate the first day of your server, is there a way to place put in your authentication token or?
When you're executing to see if it-
Yeah, when you're like that runs it.
Yeah, like you can specify, so in this .graphql config, you can specify headers. So you could just add an authentication token as a header in this .graphql config. So yeah.
How do you handle HTTP errors? Does it handle it itself or?
Yeah. So that's left up to RxJava really. So like if there's an HTTP error that gets thrown, then it will just go to the error block in your Rx subscription.
So it throws an exception for HTTP errors.
Yes. Yeah, it will.
So one change on the server side versus a REST server, your responses for HTTP through GraphQL is either 200 or 400. There's nothing else.
Interesting.
So if you do any like,
So if the
for
server
example,
screws up, it's still 400.
yeah, any of our errors that we throw are all 400 errors. If we have the server die horribly, it throws a 400.
Is that because your backend's set up that way, or that's just
That's
GraphQL?
GraphQL setup. If you read through the documentation, they specifically say this is all it's
Yeah,
strictly supported.
Interesting.
Everything's post too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, that's REST, but still, if you get down there, it's all post, even though you're doing a request.
Yeah. Kind of an interesting quirk. Yeah.
Yeah. Because you have to push the data that's the string.
One also thing to consider with GraphQL is right now, for Android at least, I'm not sure for iOS, Apollo's like the only client, unless you write your own for generating clients.
Amazon's the other one too.
Amazon's
But
got
they
that.
leverage the Apollo client.
No.
For React Native, there's Relay as well. And that's, I think, the number 2 item.
Yeah.
But like for like native Android, Apollo's your only option right now, unless you write your own. But
Yeah.
I mean, it's been stable. We've been in production with GraphQL while Apollo was in alpha, and we've been fine.
Yeah.
Pretty good loads. Lots of users.
But
Yeah.
it's some of the bigger queries we had.
It's been a few months now. iOS even longer. Yeah, we've been using GraphQL pretty well, and not really any issues compared to REST that are major. I don't think so.
That's nice because like responses are smaller.
Yeah.
Like it depends on how
I
optimized
was
your
gonna say, it's just,
your risk.
that's why my first comment was like, well, if it allows your server side guy to go, there you go, and then you pick out what you want type of thing.
Yeah, I think we really agree. Like, when I was working with GitHub, it works great because you get exactly what you want and all what you want, and yet they can be agnostic to any client. So you have a very specific client. Yeah, sixes.
But we have several services at our place where it's like, it's just like hundreds of thousands of, come on, give me a precise, it'd be nice to have some nice GraphQL.
Yeah.
Know what I want.
And it's going to guarantee the data type side that says it's going to be a string when it's a string. It's gonna be when it's not.
And
String
also
when
not
it's
multiple, right? Because you could do the exclamation mark on.
Yeah.
They'll throw 400 if they can't do that, right? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, or actually it'll
If I say name can't be empty.
yeah. Like honestly, like the compile time guarantees that Apollo has, like that is a huge advantage to me. Like I would hate to have to like, guess that, oh, this is probably gonna work, and then, maybe it's not QA tested as well, and then go to production, oh, there's a bunch of crashes or things like that. So like I love the static guarantees and like the compile time verification that Apollo has and GraphQL has. So. Cool. Next slide. Yeah, so the last slide I have is just a few links. So I'll post these in the Slack channel. But GraphQL introduction is really nice. Just gives you a little bit deeper overview than what I did. But if you want to learn more about how GraphQL works and the different things you can do with it, you can go to that link. There's the GitHub repo for Apollo Client if you want to set it up in your own project. There it is. And then there's a bunch of different public domain, not public domain, but just public GraphQL APIs. And so there's a link to the one that I used in this demonstration. And then the GitHub repo for my example project. And then I'll throw all these and then also link to the logging interceptor that I use. Anyway, yeah, that's all I have. So.